I remember the first time I set foot in Valdivia. There was something about the place that felt unsettled, like the earth beneath me was trying to tell me something. It was a small coastal town, but it had this ancient, raw energy to it. The kind of energy you can feel deep in your bones, and maybe that's why I came. I thought I could study the land, measure its movements, predict its future. But I wasn't prepared for Andres. I met him the second day I arrived, when I went to the local cafe, to get a sense of the community. He was sitting by the window, his back straight, his dark eyes focused on the horizon like he was waiting for something. I hadn't expected to see him again after that day. He was just a fisherman, a local, nothing more than a fleeting part of my research. But as the days passed, I kept finding myself drawn to him. The way he spoke, his quiet intensity. There was something about the way he looked at the land that made my scientific explanations feel inadequate. "Do you believe the earth has a pulse?" I asked him once, half joking. He didn't smile. "I believe it has a heartbeat." We spent hours talking, or rather, I did most of the talking, explaining my theories about seismic activity, about plate tectonics and fault lines. But every time I spoke, I could see the shadow of something ancient in his eyes, something far beyond the data I relied on. To him, the land wasn't just rock. It was alive. And that thought, so primitive, so foreign to everything I believed, stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Days passed and our strange partnership began to take shape. I'd go out with Andres on his boat, trailing him along the jagged coastline as he showed me the land he'd known his whole life. He'd point out rocks and hills, warning me of places where the earth had cracked open during previous tremors, places where the sea had claimed the land. "The land isn't just our home," he'd tell me, voice low and earnest. "It's part of us. The earth feels our pain, our joys. It remembers." It was hard to ignore the way he spoke, like the earth was something to be revered, not just studied, as if it had a consciousness. I laughed it off, of course. I was a scientist after all. But as the days went by, I began to notice little things. The way the birds flew in a circle when we were near the cliffs. How the waves seemed to pull back from the shore just before the wind picked up. One afternoon, while walking along the beach, I felt a subtle tremor beneath my feet. It was so faint, I thought it was just me, that perhaps the ground was simply uneven, but Andres stopped in his tracks. "You felt that, didn't you?" I nodded, confused. It was just an aftershock, probably. He shook his head, his face pale. "No, Isabel, it's something else. The earth is warning us." I didn't understand him then. I thought he was exaggerating, like all the locals who seemed to live in constant fear of the earth's unpredictability. But now, looking back, I realize how right he was. It wasn't long before the tension in the town began to grow. There had been whispers, rumors of an impending disaster. The local authorities assured us it was nothing, but the earth felt different. It was as though sasotrai sanamai. Something beneath the surface was waiting to erupt. I'd barely had time to process the growing unease in Valdivia when I got an invitation to present my findings at a conference in Santiago. It was a huge opportunity, but it didn't feel right. There was something in the air, an electric tension that I couldn't shake. I turned to Andres. "What do you think?" He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "I think you should leave." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had come here to study, to understand the land, not to be afraid of it, but something in the way he said it, urgent, desperate even, made me hesitate. "I can't leave now," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "There's too much I need to learn." He didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes shadowed. "Then stay close to the sea, Isabel. It's not the land you need to worry about." Days passed, and I dove deeper into my research, ignoring the sinking feeling that was slowly creeping in. Valdivia was on edge, and the people seemed to sense something I couldn't quite grasp. One evening, as I was reviewing my notes, a letter arrived, delivered to the cafe where I'd been staying. It was handwritten, the ink smeared in places as if hurriedly written. The letter warned me of a great quake, one much larger than anything I had ever studied. It spoke of an ancient reckoning, of the earth demanding something from us. I showed it to Andres the next morning. His face went pale when he saw the letter, his hands shaking as he held it. "You must leave," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Now." "I won't leave," I said firmly. "This is just superstition." But deep down, something was changing inside me. My scientific mind couldn't explain it, but my heart, my gut, told me there was something to the story. Days blurred together in Valdivia. I spent my mornings poring over seismic data, measuring the slightest shifts in the Earth's crust, and my afternoons with Andres, walking along the coastline or sitting by the fire as he told me more of his stories about the spirits that lived in the mountains, the wind, and the sea. I couldn't help but be drawn to him, not just to his knowledge of the land, but to the quiet, broken pieces of himself he'd slowly allowed me to see. He wasn't just a fisherman. There was a sadness in his eyes, something buried deep beneath the surface. And I couldn't ignore it. I'd tried asking him about his past, about the family he always spoke of so reverently, but each time he would deflect, shifting the conversation back to the land, to the earth. "I've seen the earth take everything, Isabel," he told me one evening, his voice a low murmur in the dark. "Homes, families, lives. But it always gives back. It doesn't forget. It remembers the people who lived on it." I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. But part of me was terrified of what he was hinting at, this belief that the earth had a memory, a reckoning of its own. It was then that I found the journal. I had been looking for notes on seismic activity when I stumbled across it, hidden beneath a stack of maps in his small cabin. It was worn and tattered, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it carefully, reading the notes that Andres had written over the years. The entries were filled with his observations about the land, about the way the tides shifted before storms, how the birds flew differently before a tremor. But there were also personal notes, fragments of a past I had never asked about, the quake that took my family. The day the earth swallowed my home, it was like a punch to my gut. I had always known there was something darker in his past, but to read it in his own words, it was more than I could bear. I closed the journal quickly, guilt and sorrow flooding my chest. That night I confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked softly, my voice trembling. "About your family. About the quake." Andres didn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared out at the sea, his face shadowed. "It's not something you can understand, Isabel. The earth is unforgiving, and it doesn't forget. It remembers everything." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. We sat in silence, the weight of his past hanging between us like a storm waiting to break. By the time the end of May arrived, the town's unease had reached a breaking point. People were starting to leave, packing up their belongings and heading for the hills, convinced that the worst was yet to come. I had heard rumors of tremors that were felt further inland, in places I had never imagined. And still, I kept pushing forward with my research, convinced that my work could somehow predict what was coming. But Andres wasn't so sure. "Leave, Isabel," he said one morning, his voice urgent. "This is bigger than you think. The earth is preparing for something terrible. You need to go." I shook my head. "I can't just leave, not now." "Then you'll be here when it happens," he said quietly, looking me squarely in the eyes. "And you'll never be the same." I didn't know what he meant, but the fear in his voice chilled me to my core. I couldn't leave now. I needed to know. I needed to understand what had drawn me to this place in the first place. The ground felt different somehow. The air was thick, with a tension that made every step feel heavier. I kept my eyes on my data, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that clung to my every movement. May 22nd, 1960, the day the earth trembled. It started as a low rumble beneath my feet. I was in the local library, looking through the archives, when the tremor hit. At first it was just a slight shake, something I'd felt before. But then it grew. The walls of the library buckled, bookshelves toppled over, and the ground beneath me roared in fury. I heard screams from outside, felt the ground beneath my feet crack open as though it were alive. The windows shattered, and the room spun as I tried to find my balance. Panic surged through me, but there was no time to think. I had to move. I rushed outside, my heart racing as the earth continued to shake. The buildings around me swayed, and I could see people running, screaming, desperate to escape. And then I saw Andres. He was standing at the edge of the town, staring out at the sea. His face was expressionless, his body tense. It was as if he had known this moment would come. I ran toward him, but just as I reached him, the ground split open, and I was thrown to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, my breath caught in my throat, and looked up to see him still standing, unmoving, as if the earth itself had claimed him. And then, silence. The earth had finally stopped shaking. The roar of the waves crashing against the shore was all I could hear. And through the chaos, through the dust and the rubble, I realized that the world had shifted. Everything had changed. The days that followed the earthquake felt like a nightmare. I couldn't tell where the town ended and the destruction began. Valdivia, once a small but vibrant coastal community, was now reduced to rubble. The air was thick with dust, the smell of salt water and broken wood clinging to everything. I had never felt such a profound stillness in my life. The earth had spoken, and in its wake, there was nothing but silence. I wandered through the ruins, searching for familiar faces, for signs of life. But everywhere I looked, there was only devastation. The library, where I had spent so many hours, was gone. The cafes, the houses, the streets, everything was gone. Andres was nowhere to be found. I went to his cabin, but it was buried under a pile of debris. I dug through the rubble with my bare hands, calling his name, but there was no answer. His boat had been smashed against the rocks by the force of the waves. Everything was gone. It was as if he had vanished into the earth, swallowed whole by the land he had loved so much. The days turned into weeks, but the weight of the earthquake never lifted. It lingered in the air, in the shattered remnants of the town. There was an emptiness now, a quietness that felt wrong. I couldn't leave. I couldn't walk away from the place that had changed me so profoundly, from the man who had shown me a different way of seeing the world. But without Andres, it felt like there was nothing left to hold on to. He had been the connection I had to this land, to its mysteries. I spent my time in the ruins, searching for answers. The letters, the journal, the stories he had told me. They all began to take on new meaning. It wasn't just about the earth anymore. It was about him. I found a letter in his cabin, written just before the earthquake. It was addressed to me. The earth remembers, Isabel, and it will call us all back. You will understand in time, when the land is ready. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. Was he warning me? Or had he known something I didn't? Days passed in a haze, the town slowly beginning to rebuild itself as best it could. But the feeling of disquiet never left me. The tremors had stopped, but there was something in the air, something that still pulled at my soul. I returned to the cliffs where Andres had once stood, staring out at the sea. It was here that he had told me about the spirits of the land, the ancient forces that lived beneath the surface. I had dismissed it then, but now it felt different. The earth beneath me felt alive, as though it were watching, waiting. And that's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the cliff, his back to me, looking out at the sea. I froze, my heart racing. Andres? I called out, my voice shaking. He turned slowly, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. He looked different. There was something in his eyes, something distant, something cold. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I remembered. It was something else, something unsettling. "I knew you'd come," he said softly. "The land always calls us back." I didn't know how to respond. He had vanished for weeks, and now he was standing before me as if nothing had happened. He looked the same, but there was something in the air around him that made me feel like I was seeing a stranger. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice trembling. I thought you were gone." Andres didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the sea, his gaze distant. "The earth called me," he said finally. "It called me to witness what was coming. And now I understand." I didn't know what he meant, but the words unsettled me. "What's coming?" He turned to face me fully, and there was a depth in his eyes that I had never seen before. "The land remembers, Isabel, and it is not finished with us yet." I took a step back. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" "I had to leave," he said, his voice low and almost apologetic. "There's something ancient beneath this place, something that claims us. It called to me, and I had no choice but to listen." It was then that I realized Andres wasn't just a fisherman. He had always known the land in a way I couldn't understand, in a way that went beyond science, beyond reason. The earthquake had been a warning, but the true reckoning, the true test, was still to come. We sat together for hours, talking about the past, about the earthquake, about the land. Andres explained that the ancient forces he had always spoken of weren't just myths. They were real as the earth itself. And the earthquake? It had been only the beginning. "The land is alive, Isabel," he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. "And it has a purpose. It's not done with us. Not yet." I didn't understand. I didn't know what he meant, but I couldn't deny the fear in his voice. Something was coming. Something bigger than either of us could fathom. Andres told me he had felt it, deep within the earth, a rumble far greater than the earthquake. He said it was like the land was waking up, preparing for something. "What do we do?" I asked, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. "We wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And we listen." The days turned colder as May gave way to June. The town continued to rebuild, but there was an air of unease that clung to everything. People talked in hushed voices about the future, about the land that had claimed so much, and what it might still demand. Andres and I spent more time together, but it wasn't the same. There was a distance between us now, an understanding that we were both tied to something larger, something we couldn't control. I tried to focus on my research, but it was hard. The land had become something unknowable. The more I learned, the less I understood. One night, as we sat on the cliffs watching the stars, Andres turned to me and asked, "Do you still believe the earth is just rock and soil, Isabel?" I looked at him, at the way the darkness seemed to cling to him, and I realized that I wasn't sure anymore. The weeks passed, and the tension continued to rise. I couldn't shake the feeling that the earth was preparing for something, that it was waiting for the right moment to strike. But Andres was changing. He wasn't the man I had first met, the one who told me stories of the sea and the land with such warmth. Now he was distant, lost in his thoughts, consumed by something I couldn't understand. One evening, after a particularly intense conversation about the forces of nature, he looked at me with a strange, unreadable expression. "You're not ready, Isabel," he said softly. "You may never be." The nights in Valdivia had become colder, and the air, thick with the remnants of the earthquake, felt heavier with each passing day. The earth had quieted, but the tension between Andres and me only grew. We spent more time together, but it wasn't the same. The intimacy we once shared was now clouded with the weight of the unknown. Andres had changed. He was consumed by something deeper, something I couldn't quite grasp. Yet, when I looked into his eyes, I could still see the man I had met on those cliffs, the one who spoke with such reverence for the land, the one who had opened my eyes to a world beyond the scientific. But there was a distance between us, a barrier I couldn't cross. One evening, as we sat by a fire on the beach, watching the flames flicker against the darkening sky, I felt his presence beside me. His warmth was a comfort, yet his silence was a growing ache. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap that had formed, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of what he had become, or maybe it was the fear of losing him altogether. Andres glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Isabel, you know I'm not the same man I was before," he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know. I feel it too." He shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a lifeline. The electricity that passed between us was palpable, but there was an edge to it, a sense that we were both holding back from something deeper. "Then why do you stay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why stay with me when everything is so different?" I took a breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. "Because I'm not ready to let go of you," I said, my voice trembling. "And because I still believe in what we have, even if it's changed." His gaze softened, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to disappear. It was just the two of us, the fire between us, and the ocean whispering its eternal song. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers tracing the outline of my jaw, gently, as if I might break under his touch. His thumb brushed over my lips, sending a shiver down my spine. "I'm afraid, Isabel," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "Afraid that the land will take me away, that I'll be swallowed up by it again, just like everything else. I don't want to pull you into that darkness." "I'm not afraid," I whispered, my heart racing in my chest. "I'm here, with you, always." He leaned closer, his forehead resting against mine. His breath was warm against my skin, and in that moment, I could feel the years of grief, fear, and longing in his touch. "I don't deserve you, mi mercer, sorry, stoltry, I'm ended." "Yes, you do," I replied softly. "You always have." The distance between us closed in that moment, not with words, but with the simple act of reaching for each other. His lips found mine, tentative at first, as if he was testing the waters. But I didn't pull away. Instead, I deepened the kiss, letting the warmth of his touch fill the empty spaces in my heart. The kiss was slow, and yet it felt like a lifetime. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet, fragile connection between two souls who had weathered storms and earthquakes, who had survived the unraveling of their world. And in that kiss, I felt it, the earth beneath us, still shifting, still alive, but also steady, as if it had finally found its place. When we pulled away, our foreheads touching, I could feel his heartbeat against mine. "I won't let go of you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Andres smiled, a soft, almost sad smile. Then we face whatever comes, together. The days that followed felt like a dream, a fragile dream we both held on to with everything we had. As the town continued to rebuild, there were moments of fleeting peace. We would walk along the shoreline, hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing. I could feel his presence next to me, steady, unwavering like the earth itself. But as the days passed, the warning signs grew more pronounced. The air around us seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't place, an energy that seemed to pulse beneath our feet. The land was restless again, and it felt like something was brewing beneath the surface. I could feel it. The same sense of unease I had felt before, only now, it was stronger. One night, as we stood by the cliffs, gazing out at the dark ocean, Andres turned to me. His hand was warm in mine, but his grip was tight, like he was holding on to something, or perhaps to me for fear of losing everything. "Isabel," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly, "I can't promise you that I'll be here forever. The land, it's calling me, and I can't ignore it. I don't know what's going to happen." I looked at him, my heart aching with the knowledge that this moment might be fleeting. "I don't need promises," I said softly. "I just need you, for as long as you're here." His eyes softened, and for a moment, the fear that had been consuming him seemed to fade, replaced by something warmer, something deeper. And then he kissed me again, this time with more urgency, as if the world might end tomorrow. And we had no time to waste. In that kiss, I felt the tremors of the earth, but also the quiet reassurance that for now, we had each other. As the days grew darker and the air heavier with the impending sense of change, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The land might call, but our love, our connection, was something that neither time nor disaster could take away. We spent the days in quiet moments, stolen glances, and whispered promises. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of us, lost in a moment of peace before the storm. But the storm was coming. I could feel it in my bones, in the air that seemed to thicken with each passing day. Andres was distant again, lost in his thoughts. But when he held me, when he kissed me, it felt like the world stopped moving, like everything was still, if only for a moment. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. No matter what the earth threw our way, no matter how much the world seemed to be crumbling around us, I would always be there, right beside him. The air was thick with a storm that never seemed to break. It was as though the earth had paused, holding its breath. The land, once so familiar, now felt foreign to me. There was a stillness that hung in the atmosphere, the kind that comes before something monumental, something that changes everything. Andres and I spent more time together, but his mood had shifted once again. The man I had once known, so open, so full of life, was slipping further away. His thoughts were consumed by something I couldn't see, something far beyond my understanding. I wanted to reach out, to draw him back to me, but the distance between us was growing with every passing day. "Isabel," he said one evening, his voice more distant than I'd ever heard it. "I feel it again. The pull of the earth, like it's calling me deeper. It's as if it's waiting for me to listen." I could see the fear in his eyes, but it was mixed with something else, something almost like longing. He wasn't just afraid of the land anymore. He was drawn to it, as if it held some part of him he couldn't let go of. "I don't want to lose you, Andres," I said, my voice trembling as I stepped closer to him. "You've already given so much to it. I need you to stay with me." He turned, his hand brushing against my cheek as he looked into my eyes. "I don't want to leave you," he whispered, his voice raw. "But the land, it won't let me go. It's calling me and I can't ignore it. I need to understand it, Isabel. I need to understand why it's calling." Tears stung my eyes as I held his gaze, the weight of his words sinking deep into my heart. He was torn between the love he had for me and the pull of the land that had always been a part of him. How could I compete with that? How could I hold on to him when the very earth beneath us was pulling him away? But I wouldn't give up. Not yet. "I'll go with you," I said, surprising even myself with the certainty in my voice. "We'll find the answers together. We'll face whatever the land is asking of us, side by side." His expression softened, and for the first time in days, a hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. You'd come with me, even after everything? Always, I whispered. We'll face it together, no matter what comes. The days that followed were filled with a sense of quiet urgency. We prepared to venture deeper into the wilderness, into the heart of the land where Andres had always felt the pull. It was a place few people knew, a place where the earth held its secrets close. I didn't understand why he felt drawn there, but I trusted him. If this was what he needed, then I would be there with him. We traveled by foot, moving through the dense forest that surrounded Valdivia. The further we went, the more the world seemed to change. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient trees, and the silence was almost overwhelming. There was no sound except the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor and the occasional call of distant birds. Andres walked ahead, his every step deliberate, as if he knew exactly where he was going. I followed him, my heart heavy with a mixture of fear and love. I didn't know what we would find, but I knew that the deeper we went, the more I was losing him. Finally, after what seemed like hours, we arrived at a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone, ancient and weathered by time. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, covered in strange carvings that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. The ground around it was disturbed, as though something had recently been unearthed. "This is it," Andres said, his voice reverberating with awe. "This is what I've been searching for, the heart of the land." I looked at him, unsure of what to say. The air felt charged, alive with something beyond my comprehension. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Andres stepped closer to the stone, his hand outstretched. "We listen," he said softly. "The land will tell us what it wants." I watched as he placed his hand on the stone, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then, the earth seemed to respond. A low hum filled the air, a vibration that ran through the ground and into my very bones. It was like the land was alive, breathing, waiting. Andres closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly as he listened. I could see the strain in his face, the way he was holding himself back, as if something was trying to pull him deeper into the earth. "Isabel," he said, his voice strained. "I can feel it. It's not just the land, it's me. It's calling to me. I don't know if I can fight it much longer." I rushed to his side, grabbing his arm to steady him. "Andres, don't. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here. Please." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the one who had shown me the beauty of the world, who had held me in the quiet moments of our love. But then the moment passed, and that distant look returned. "I have to," he said softly. "I have to understand why it's calling to me." Before I could stop him, he stepped forward, his hand pressing harder against the stone. The hum grew louder, and suddenly I felt it, like the earth was pulling us in. The energy was overwhelming, like a force I couldn't comprehend. I reached for him, but the moment my hand touched the stone, everything went dark. I woke up in darkness, disoriented. The familiar sounds of the forest were gone. The air felt still, as if the world had stopped turning. I sat up quickly, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had happened. "Andres?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Andres!" There was no answer. The only sound was the thrum of the earth beneath me, deep and steady. It felt like the land itself was alive, breathing in a way that I couldn't explain. Panic started to rise in my chest, but then I felt it. A presence, a familiar warmth. Andres was here, somewhere. I called out again, and this time I heard his voice, faint but clear. "Isabel, I'm here." I scrambled to my feet and followed the sound of his voice, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness felt endless, but I pressed on, driven by the need to find him, to make sure he was okay. Finally, I saw him. He was standing in front of me, his eyes closed, his hand still pressed against the stone. He looked different, strange, almost like he wasn't fully there. "Andres!" I cried, rushing to his side. He opened his eyes, but they were empty, distant, like he wasn't seeing me. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice faint as if he was fading away. "The land, it's part of me now." The darkness around us felt suffocating, pressing in on me with a force that made it difficult to breathe. Andres was still standing there, his form seemingly suspended between this world and something else, something that felt ancient and unknowable. I reached out, my fingers grazing his arm, and for a brief moment, he reacted. His body shuddered, as though waking from a deep slumber, and his eyes flickered with recognition. "Isabel," he murmured, his voice weak but full of relief. "I can feel you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I held on to him. "Andres, please, talk to me. You're scaring me." He took a slow, trembling breath, but his gaze was still distant. "I don't know how to explain it, Isabel. The land, it's like it's pulling me into it, deeper than before. It's calling me to understand it, to become one with it." His voice broke on the last word, the weight of his confession hanging in the air between us. I gripped his shoulders, forcing him to look at me. "Andres, you don't have to become one with it. We can figure this out together. I'm here. Please, don't let it take you." He shook his head slowly, as though he couldn't tear himself away from the invisible force surrounding him. "I don't have a choice. The land is part of me now. I'm not sure how to fight it anymore." His hand trembled as he lifted it, almost as if it was being drawn toward the stone again. "But Isabel, I need you. I need to feel you, to remind myself of what it was like before all of this." My heart broke at the sound of his voice, so desperate, so lost. Without thinking, I stepped closer, wrapping my arms around him, pulling him into the warmth of my embrace. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was trying to pull away, but I held him tight. "Whatever it is, Andres, I won't let you go. You're not alone in this," I whispered into his ear. "I won't let the earth take you from me." There was a long pause, as though the very air between us was still waiting. Then, as if he were gathering his strength, Andres finally relaxed, his arms slowly wrapping around me in return. I felt the warmth of his touch, a fleeting reminder of the man I loved, the man who had walked beside me through the quiet moments of our love. "I don't know how much longer I can resist it," he admitted, his voice a quiet tremor. "It's like a pull I can't ignore, but being with you, it's the only thing that makes sense now." His confession struck me like a bolt of lightning, but I knew it was true. The land had changed him, had consumed him in a way I couldn't fully understand, but I wasn't ready to lose him. Not yet. Not when there was still so much to fight for. "Then, fight with me," I urged, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at my chest. "We'll face this together. You don't have to do this alone. Not when you have me." For a moment, Andres didn't respond, but I could feel his body soften in my arms. Slowly, the trembling stopped. It was as though he had made a decision, some silent resolve filling the space between us. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered again, the words more broken than before. "You won't," I said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eyes. "We'll find a way. We'll fight whatever this is. Together." I could see a flicker of hope in his eyes, a brief spark of the man I had fallen in love with. For the first time in days, it seemed as though the weight of the earth wasn't so heavy on his shoulders, but I knew this wasn't over. There was still the stone, still the pull of the land, and I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if we didn't find a way to stop it. "Do you think we can stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Andres didn't answer right away. He just looked at the stone, still glowing faintly, as though it were waiting for him to return. Then, with a resolve I hadn't seen in him for days, he turned back to me. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I know we have to try." The days that followed felt like a slow descent into something I couldn't understand. We spent more time at the clearing where the stone remained, a silent observer to the battle between Andres and the earth that called to him. He seemed different now. There was a weariness in his eyes, a sense of quiet surrender that I couldn't ignore. It was as though he was holding on to something precious, but the pull of the land was growing stronger. We walked the path back to the village one afternoon, hand in hand, but the air around us was heavy, filled with a quiet tension. I could feel the storm that had been building for days, the kind of storm that wasn't just in the sky. It was in our hearts, in our minds. It felt like the world was on the edge of breaking, and no matter how much we tried to hold on to each other, it was slipping away. "Isabel," Andres said, his voice low and hesitant. "I need to tell you something, Basel." I turned to him, my heart racing. "What is it?" He stopped walking, turning to face me. His expression was serious, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. "The land isn't just calling me, it's calling to both of us. There's something here, something ancient, something we don't understand. I think it's pulling us both toward it." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" "The stone. It's not just a marker, it's a gateway, Isabel. It's been waiting for us, for me, for both of us." I shook my head, trying to process what he was saying. "You're talking about something impossible. We can't just—" "Maybe we can't," he interrupted, his voice raw. "But the land is making its choice. I can feel it. And I don't know if we'll survive it." The words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and frightening. This wasn't just a force we could fight. It was something deeper, something that had been part of the earth for centuries, and now it was reaching out to us. "Isabel," he said softly, his voice full of pain, "I don't want you to get hurt, but I can't run from it anymore. We have to face whatever this is, no matter the cost." The silence between us was deafening, and in that moment, I realized the truth. Andres had changed, and not just in the way I had hoped. He was becoming something else, something that was an entirely human. I reached out for him, my heart breaking. "I'll face it with you, no matter what it is." He looked at me with gratitude, but there was something else in his eyes, something resigned. Then, we face it together. We returned to the clearing that night, the moon high above us, casting a pale light on the ancient stone. The air felt thick, charged with a power I couldn't name. The land had spoken, and now it was time for us to listen. Andres stepped forward first, his hand hovering above the stone. I followed, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and love. Whatever came next, we were in it together. I held my breath as he touched the stone once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. He seemed to know what to do, as if he had become part of it, part of the earth itself. The hum that filled the air was louder now, vibrating through the ground beneath us. The earth seemed to pulse, alive with energy, and I felt it too, like something ancient and powerful was awakening inside me. "Andres?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "What is happening?" His eyes met mine, and for the first time in days, I saw him clearly. His gaze sharp, filled with purpose. "We're about to find out." The hum of the stone reverberated through the air, a steady pulse that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. But as the vibrations grew stronger, something else began to happen, a subtle shift, like the earth itself was easing its grip on Andres and me. For the first time in days, The weight that had been pressing down on him seemed to lighten. Andres turned to me, his face a mixture of wonder and relief. "It's not pulling anymore," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I can feel it. It's letting me go." I took a step closer to him, my heart swelling with a mixture of love and hope. "What do you mean? The land isn't calling you anymore?" He shook his head slowly, a small smile forming on his lips. "Number, I think it was never about pulling me away. I think it was waiting for me to understand. All this time it was asking me to listen, to honor its ancient power. And now, I finally hear it. Isabel, the land isn't just something to fear, it's something to protect." The words sunk deep into my heart. I had always feared the land's power, but now I saw it through his eyes, a force of nature, ancient and beautiful, not something to be feared, but something to be revered. The storm in his eyes had cleared, and in its place was a peace I hadn't seen in him in so long. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "And you're at peace with it?" He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at me. "I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And that's with you, Isabel." My breath caught in my throat. I had feared that this journey would tear us apart, that the land's call would be too strong, that it would consume him. But instead, it had brought him closer to understanding himself and to me. We had faced the unknown together, and in doing so, we had found something more profound than we ever could have imagined. As the night stretched on, the energy from the stone slowly faded, the air calming around us. The stars above seemed to shine even brighter, as though the earth had been waiting for us to discover its truth. The tension that had once filled the air had dissipated, leaving behind a quiet peace. Andres took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. "You know, Isabel, I think the land wanted us to understand its story, to feel its history. But more than that, I think it wanted us to remember that we're all part of something greater, that we're not separate from it." I smiled softly, my heart overflowing with emotion. "I think you're right. We're all connected by the earth, the stars, the love we share. It's all one." He pulled me into an embrace, and in that moment, everything else faded away. There was no land, no stone, no mysterious pull, only the warmth of his arms around me and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. We were at peace, together, and there, in the quiet stillness of the night, I realized something profound. Love, like the earth, is vast and enduring. It can withstand the storms, the unknowns, and the mysteries of life. And in the end, it is love that holds everything together, like an unbroken thread woven through time. "I love you, Isabel," Andres whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. As the night stretched on, we stood there in the clearing, beneath the vast, infinite sky. And for the first time, I truly felt the depth of the earth's wisdom, the way it holds everything in balance. The land had shown us its power, but it had also shown us its beauty, its quiet grace. We weren't just two souls lost in a world of confusion and fear. We were two souls grounded, connected to something greater than ourselves, with the promise that no matter where life took us, we would always have each other. Together, we would face the world with open hearts and a love that could never be shaken. And as the last of the night shadows faded and the first light of dawn touched the horizon, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together.